Hello, hi everyone, and welcome to all of you who have joined the ATSI Agriculture and Food Forum webinar today. I'm Nina Mitter, Director, Centre for Horticultural Science at Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation, or QAFI, at the University of Queensland, and I'll be your moderator and host for the evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledgement of the country. As we gather for this meeting from different places around Australia, I would first like to acknowledge custodians of the lands from which we meet today. And I'm joining you today from the Turrbal and Yagera people's land. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us online today. As we share and discuss our knowledge and practices, I deeply acknowledge forever the knowledge that is deep knowledge forever embedded in the custodianship of the country. So before we begin today's exciting webinar, some housekeeping things. So firstly, the webinar presentation today is being recorded. Also, for all the attendees of this webinar, you are on mute and you can't be seen as well. The format for today is that we have two speakers, two really distinguished and awesome speakers. There will be a Q&A session of 10 minutes after each speaker's presentation, and then there will be an open Q&A as well at the end. There is a Q&A button for you to type your question while you're listening to the speakers. Only the panelists will be able to see your question, and I will state your question to the speakers at the end. If you want, you can also mention your organization's name in the question, and it will be nice if you don't use the chat button for questions. So let me introduce the webinar today, and it is on agricultural and food production. I'm from India and agriculture is in my DNA. I grew up realizing the power of agriculture socially, economically, environmentally, and politically. And this has come to the forefront even more in today's context, whether it is the red code for climate change or zero emission targets or the natural disasters, or the supply chains affected by pandemic, or the new trade imperatives. I really feel that it is no longer enough to talk about feeding 10 billion people in 2050, but it is about today, the next season, the next year, and the year after. So on this topic, I really feel privileged to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mirjana Prica, who is currently the Managing Director of Food and Agribusiness Growth Centre, where she has been instrumental in launching a number of significant initiatives, value adding to the growth of this sector, and also providing a vision and pathways for future. Mirjana sits on boards and advisory groups of various CRCs, universities, industry organizations. I'm very privileged, actually. Mirjana sits on the board of QAFI as well at the University of Queensland, and we have really benefited from her being on our advisory board. She's a visionary who focuses on innovation to deliver commercial outcomes. So over to you, Mirjana.
Thank you, Nina, for that very kind introduction. And I think you're being too generous in terms of your acknowledgements, but I do appreciate it, and thank you. And likewise, greetings everyone from Sydney, a gorgeous day in Sydney. And we're looking forward to connecting with each and every one of you across the country very soon. I'm really delighted to be here virtually. Today, I'm actually going to set the scene for the growth of the sector through a number of key foundational reports that we have done. And I'm going to touch on these reports, and they'll be referenced. So I don't expect you to walk away with all the detail that's in the slides, because there is a lot of information in the slides. But I'm going to touch on a few examples to illustrate how advances in food and agriculture is going to impact what's on the future plate for the food and agribusiness sector. Nina's touched on, many of you know a bit about the growth centres. There are 6 growth centres that were funded by the federal government under the Growth Centres Initiative, and we were established to drive the productivity and the competitiveness of our sectors through innovation. And I lead the food and agribusiness sector, as Nina has highlighted. Everything that we do, and everything I touch on today is going to be touched on through the lens of the whole of the value chain. We work with everyone collaboratively across all industries and commodities, from the inputs through to production, processing, distribution, marketing, and through to the consumer. But we look at it through the lens of value adding, because we believe that's what you need to do to actually extract more value and capture more value in Australia. So everything that I touch on has the value add perspective. And this is really important because a lot of people interchange, figures in terms of contribution to the economy. And we've just got to make sure we're talking from the same values perspective. So what do we do as an organisation? The magic ingredients, if you excuse the pun, working in the food industry, this is how we catalyse the growth of the industry. We share knowledge. We believe that knowledge is foundational to informing decisions, whether it be around research, around innovation, or around any business decisions. We also believe that building the capability and the capacity of the sector, not only researchers, but businesses, to go about innovating, but also their ability to actually enter a particular market. And don't assume that everyone knows how to enter a particular channel, because there are certain nuances on each of these. And finally, what we believe is creating connections between researchers and businesses so we can tackle the right challenges, but also between businesses and businesses, buyers and suppliers. And we do a lot of connecting. And recently we've been helping the wine industry connect with buyers overseas, with them being impacted with the tariffs increasing in certain key markets overseas. They obviously need to find another home for their wine. So we've been working with them to connect them with buyers in different markets from their traditional channels where they've been operating. So we believe these are the magic tools that the industry needs to help catalyse their growth. So one of the pieces of work that I'd really like to draw your attention to, and it's really forming the basis of my discussion today, my presentation, is called Project 2030. It's about how do we double the Australian food and agribusiness sector by 2030. The reference is there for you, so I do encourage you to go to the full reference and get the details. But a lot of this work that we have done says that if we work collaboratively and together and strive towards one vision, our sector has the potential to be a lot bigger than what we currently are, of sitting around 60 billion of gross value add. We could be an industry of 200 billion by 2030. So we can more than triple our sector's output if we do things differently. The reason why I'm mentioning the Food and Beverage National Manufacturing Priority Roadmap is last year the Prime Minister announced a 1.4 billion modern manufacturing strategy in the budget in October. And the reason why I'm mentioning this here and how it relates to Project 2030 is there were 6 priority areas identified in the modern manufacturing industry strategy, and the food and beverage is one of the key priority areas. Our work, Project 2030, is heavily referenced throughout this roadmap. So I do encourage you to go to the reference and to our reference, because it has a lot of valuable information and it can be used as a resource if you are applying for funding. And at the moment, there is a stream open called the collaboration stream, where the government is calling for projects, collaborative projects that are going to transform the food and beverage manufacturing sector. But getting back to Project 2030, and what underpins that 200 billions that I talked about in terms of the future growth of our sector, we looked at a lot of the trends, and trends are trends, they don't change significantly. And there are 10 major trends that impact the future demand of what we grow and produce. And if you look on the periphery in the corners, there's lots of growth. And as Nina said, there's lots of growth due to population. You know, we've got urbanisation, there's a growing consuming class, there's an ageing population, there's increased physical connectivity, there are dietary shifts in terms of what we eat and what decisions we make about the food we eat based on our ethical views on way things are manufactured. But what's also quite interesting, particularly with COVID, is that there's been an increasing concern around food security, also about provenance and where your food comes from, but also more and more about the environmental impact and the footprint that's imposing. But what's really important also, underpinning some of these future trends, is the technological advances. And I think that's really critical to unlocking some of the value of that 200 billion through the technological advances. So what makes up the 200 billion? So on this slide, what you can see, it's 19 opportunities. And if you go from left to right, it actually highlights the different opportunities. We then have highlighted what we believe is the current value today if we were to realise the opportunity, if we had realised the opportunity, and what would it be in 2030. And then we've got the compound average growth rate on the right-hand side. And so what it basically says that there are 19 opportunities. A lot of these 19 opportunities, they're either creating a new market or they're a cost saving to businesses. Many of these opportunities are underpinned by rapidly emerging technologies, such as the Internet of Things and advanced genomics. And what they're going to do is transform not only how food is produced, but how it's distributed and tracked along the supply chain and all the way through to our plate. Of the 19 opportunities, 12 are pre-farm gate and 7 are post-farm gate. And this is really important, that we can't be thinking of a final product like bread without thinking about the flour that goes into making that bread. The flour, in fact, is a wheat, and therefore we need to understand that the properties of the wheat, the quality of the wheat, the protein content, and other attributes will determine the flavour profile, how well the bread rises. So we need to be thinking holistically about the whole value chain, not just about the post-farm gate activities, and not the parts of it. And what you can see in this slide, that the biggest opportunity is health and wellness, and then there's a sort of a plethora of other opportunities that follow through. And that's really exciting, because it's not surprising that more and more people are concerned about what they eat and drink and how it impacts their health and wellness. So the great news is not only do we have growth in our sector, but we also have jobs. And that's really, really delightful to hear. So those 19 opportunities have the scope to add an additional 300,000 jobs to the 550,000 jobs that are cut across food and agribusiness, which also includes agriculture. And what's also quite interesting, we did a split, our analysis did a split of how would the job profiles change, and particularly because we're introducing advanced technologies into businesses as they adopt new technologies and new ways of processing and going about their business. And across the different occupation types of sales workers, administrative staff, professional staff, managers, and manual labour, the actual relative percent share of each does not change significantly over the period of the next 10 years or 9 years since we're in 2021. So that's really exciting to know that not only are we going to create value and increase the contribution to our economy, but we're also going to create jobs and help people with employment. So that report is great, but now what I'd like to do is, how do we turn that into reality? I'm touching on a book that we release every year. This book is called Celebrating Australian Food and Agribusiness Innovations. This book profiles 50 stories of how businesses come together to solve a problem and to release value. They're across the value chain. And what I'm going to share with you, we're about to release the 6th edition of the book, and some of the stories in this book will touch on some of the advances in the value chain and in technology across the value chain. So I do encourage you to look at earlier versions of the book, because it does share how different people across the value chain, firms, are really unlocking that value that we talked about through Project 2030 in doubling the output of the sector by 2030. So who would have thought that we could value add to eggs? This is the first story that I'd like to share with you. So Smoked Egg Company had this vision of how they could value add to a commodity and make their product stand out on the shelf. And this was really important to them. And they wanted to, their view was to infuse the smell or the taint and flavours of smokiness into an egg that was raw. So when you cooked it, you actually had the flavour embedded within the egg. That obviously posed a challenge. They actually got some funding through one of our initiatives, and they developed the world's first chilled smoke technology, where they were able to keep the egg raw, infuse it with smoke taint, and without denaturing the protein within the egg. The great thing about the technology, not only did they manage to get an egg which didn't change its microbiological activity, and so therefore it had its shelf life extended, as well as impregnating the smoky taints throughout the egg. The great news about the product, the technology, the company realised that it wasn't viable to be exporting, smoked eggs from Australia. They actually have licensed the technology to and equipment to other countries around the world, in the US, Europe, and the Philippines, and now they're in discussions about taking the technology to Africa as well. So it's a great example of how we can really value add to a commodity by just understanding the market and what the market wants, and then looking at how we can use technology to do that. Many of you would also know that FIAL has been instrumental in developing the roadmap on how we reduce food waste by half by 2030. My team, who have now completed that bit of work, have now transitioned to the 5 Food Waste entity that's looking at driving a lot of the initiatives that were outlined in the roadmap to reducing food waste. But what I'm going to share with you now is some research. We did a feasibility study. We've just completed, and we're launching it tomorrow with the Assistant Minister Trevor Evans. And what we, in this feasibility study, what we wanted to do was go back to the original baseline, because we wanted to make sure that we understood where the waste was across the value chain, and we've actually got a figure of that now. It's been revised. It's 7.6 million metric tonnes of waste is wasted across the value chain, and you may be able to see it in this slide. It's a bit small even for me without my glasses, but that's not the message that I want you to walk away. The message that I want you to walk away is that, you know, there is waste that's been wasted, but more importantly, what we wanted to do in this study, we wanted to link the food that's wasted, what does it actually mean to the Australian economy through a number of different lenses in terms of its impact on climate and on the environment. And on the right-hand side, we have those figures. So first of all, food waste costs the Australian economy, or the industry, $36.6 billion. The second thing that the 7.6 million metric tonnes of food waste across the value chain, it actually takes the size of Victoria, or 25 million plus hectares of land, to grow that food that we waste. That's the size of Victoria. Furthermore, the amount of water that's wasted, or that's used to actually grow that food waste, it equates to about 300 litres per person consuming per day. And finally, if you look at the carbon emissions, there is 17.5 million tonnes of CO2 released, which equates to 3% of Australia's annual emissions. So you can see from this data, this feasibility study, and in this study, it also highlights the hotspots and where we can actually target reducing the food waste by half by 2030, where we can achieve that. And the good news is about the studies that we have done, we've actually identified that it is feasible, but there's multiple measures that need to be taking place to reduce the food waste by 2030. So what the study has also done, it's saying, well, what technologies do we need? Could we leverage, or could we tap into? There is lots to reduce the food waste. There are behavioural things that need to change in terms of how people shop and how they look, how they purchase products, and how they will change their behaviours around food and food consumption. But there is also a number of other interventions that we can do to reduce the food waste, and these are as follows. We can look at how we can technically extend the shelf life of various products, and I think the smoked egg was a classic example how we could double the shelf life. Secondly, we can also improve manufacturing processes, so we minimise the waste that occurs throughout. I don't know if you've ever seen a bread line, but there's been sometimes quite a lot of bread that falls off the bread line when things don't go well. And even when you're actually blending, sometimes products can actually fall off the line. So there are lots of things that we can do to improve the processes and technologies in terms of reducing waste. But more importantly, there is some waste that we can actually value add by taking out some of the valuable components. Now, we've done a lot of work with bananas up north in Queensland with Natural Evolution, and they've done a wonderful job of converting banana waste into not only banana flour, but also extracting the valuable components, the resistant starch within the flour. And that's a great example of how you can convert waste and process it to a higher value added product. So what I would encourage you to do is the report's going to be formally released tomorrow. And in the report, it's going to touch on other advances in technology that can be used to reduce food waste by half by 2030. But the good news is it is feasible and we can achieve our target, but we've got to get on our bikes to make it happen. But I also wanted to turn your attention to how do we turn mushroom waste into really meaty food. So Fable is a company that we have also funded. They're based on the Sunshine Coast, and they really had a clever idea of how do they take shiitake mushroom waste or the stems and how do they value add to that so it won't be thrown out. And they came up with the product, and the product you can see looks like I suppose it looks like a rissole of some sort, but it's not a rissole made from, it's a rissole made from shiitake mushrooms. Fable Food, they actually participated in a Seeds of Change accelerator program that we did with Mars, the Mars company, and through their technical support and the Mars team, they actually have now successfully launched their production into a number of different markets. They have got a production facility overseas as well as in Victoria, and they're currently selling into some key markets, Singapore, China, UK and Europe. And it's a great example of how we can turn some of that vegetable waste into a value-added product. But now I'd actually like to touch on, earlier in my presentation, I touched on Project 2030 and the 19 opportunities. And I spoke about how health and wellness is the largest opportunity. And a lot of people, there's a lot of discussion about what is health and wellness. And there is a definition according to Global Wellness Institute. They say, it's really all the activities that you pursue and choices that you make and the lifestyle decisions that you do, that you lead, that leads to a holistic state of health. And you're probably thinking, well, what does this mean? And I must confess, I actually did as well. But I think this diagram really illustrates it quite nicely. They call it a health continuum, where on the left-hand side, you've got poor health, and the poor health is defined by those parameters below, that, how you feel, whether you're curing an illness, where you've got some sort of an episode, you've got a clinical condition, and so forth. Or wellness it's how, it's holistic, it's about thriving, it's about integrating to life, individual responsibility. And what they're basically saying, that depending on where you sit on this spectrum will depend to some extent about the decisions you make about not only what you do and how you behave, but also what you choose to eat. And I think, to me, that's really important, that your preferences in what you choose to eat will determine where you sit on that spectrum. And I think that's a really important message. So what that means is that everything that we put into our mouth will impact all the biochemical pathways and the chemical reactions that are highlighted here on the left, and I don't expect you to read that, but what it highlights, all the metabolic cycles that take place in our body. And if we have an appropriate diet, that's going to lead to a healthier you. And in that diagram, that's me. So I like to now focus on one of the components of our diet, and that's protein. We did a piece of work about 3 years ago that talks about protein and what's the growth opportunities of protein. And it's quite foundational in the sense that it actually highlights what we need to do to actually grow the protein market. And I think we're seeing quite a lot of that with V2 Foods, FIAL Foods, quite a few companies in the protein space that are really going to the next level and raising the profile of protein, not only in Australia, but globally as well. And the reference is there for those of you that everything I'm going to talk about is also in this reference, so you don't need to take notes. So in this report, and when we determine the size of the prize, we use the United Nations classification for the 6 categories of proteins. There are 15 protein types, and we use 6 categories. We use plant-based proteins, and they're all listed there. There's 23 different plant-based proteins. We used meat, which is the traditional definition. We used eggs and dairy, wild catch fisheries, aquaculture, and the non-traditional. And non-traditional are things like insects, microalgae, and lab-grown meat, such as the company FIAL and what they're doing. So everything that I'm going to talk about here on refers to this classification of these 6 categories. What our research showed that what were the key drivers of growth since 2000? And we found that the population growth accounted for 80% of the global protein growth in demand over this period of time till now. And what we also found, not only did the population growth account for most of the protein growth in demand for global protein, but also that the per capita consumption is also listed here. And as you can see, the per capita consumption is a second driver of the growth in protein. And basically what the data shows is that on average, a person needs about 30 kilograms of protein per annum. That's nearly half my body weight, just to give you a sense of perspective of that. And it's not surprising that as consuming classes have gotten, as people have got more and more wealthier, they're making more decisions. And you can see that the actual per capita consumption has increased significantly in some of the new emerging markets across, say, Indonesia and China, and as well as India. So what we do know is that global protein consumption has increased by 40% between 2000 and 2018. There has been growth across all categories of protein, as you can see, from plant-based meat all the way through to non-traditional, but bearing in mind non-traditional is coming from a very small base, so therefore these numbers are quite distorted. As you can see, plant-based proteins is the largest by category, and it's followed by meat and then eggs and dairy. And as I've said already, the non-traditional comes from a very small base. So although it's got a higher growth percentage, it's actually coming from a small base. So what's the protein demand going into the future? So what this slide shows, what it's going to be into 2025. And what our analysis shows is that plant-based proteins will dominate by volume, but meat-based proteins will dominate by value as the largest category. And that's what's shown here in this bar chart here. So on the left, you've got volume, and you can see that the plant-based proteins are the highest by volume. And then on the right, you can see that the meat is actually highest by value. And that's not surprising when we think about the prices that we get for a lot of our plant-based proteins are usually very not as premium as they are in meat. So let me give you an example of an alternative protein source, and this is the Edible Bug Shop. So Edible Bug Shop is a company that's profiled in our latest edition of Innovation Book. That was Australia's first and largest commercial edible insect farm and manufacturing facility. So Sky Blackburn, that you can see here in the diagram, is a food scientist and an entomologist, and she's the owner. She also participated in a Seeds Change Accelerator program with Mars, and through that program, she was able to develop a robotic technology that allowed her insect farming to be, and the processes to be implemented, so it's all automated. But not only that, though, that she could then extract some of the nutritional ingredients such as protein from the insect. So she's done a great job of turning food waste and that would normally go into landfill, and feeding her insects off this food waste to create ingredients that now have been made into corn chips, high value pasta, cookie mixes, and there's a long list of products that she has made using insects protein as an ingredient into all these different products. She has a product as under a brand called Circular Harvest. It's available in various retail stores, QSR, and specialty stores around the country. So it's a great example of how they've used advances in technology to take a protein, convert the food waste into a value-added ingredient, which then can be incorporated into different products. So finally, what I'd like to just touch on, so we talk about advances in the food and agribusiness sector and how's that going to impact what's on the plate for the industry, what's on our plate. Well, one thing I can say, what's on our plate is what the Harvard Business School have said is really important. And this is what they've said is a healthy eating plate. What we do know is that the healthy plate is going to have an element of vegetables. It's going to have an element of whole grain. It's going to have some proteins, some fruit, water, and oils. And those ingredients are going to, as we apply more and more technologies, advanced technologies on our raw materials, we're going to be able to extract different ingredients to get the different profiles. But on your plate, you're going to be eating this balanced approach into the future. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mirjana. It was really exciting, and so to hear about all the trends and what's happening and what's changing, and getting a bit of a landscape view on these things. Couple of questions for you before we move on to the next speaker. For me, you touched on a number of reports here, and we will glean a lot of information from those reports. Tell me, are we looking for more reports, or what is it that we need now?
You're absolutely right. We don't need any more reports is the short answer. I think we don't have to do any more inquiries or research to understand what needs to be done. I think the industry knows very well what needs to happen, and what we need is the support to make it happen. And so I think, and so there's two things we need. We need to no more reports. We've got to get on with it and make it happen. That's the first thing. But secondly, not only do we support research, but we've also, and support technology investment, we've also got to support businesses to do the research. And that's, I think, a real gap, particularly because our sector is made up of so many small companies. So they need the help to translate that technology into their businesses so they can actually apply it in their business. And that's always the challenge of that support being available, because it usually centers around a fancy piece of equipment or a technology. Sometimes it's the man hours, it's the labor that's required to do certain activities.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mirjana. I have some more questions here from the audience. So one question relates to the future of FIAL. So yeah, could you let us know what's happening? Liana Reid says that she understands federal government funding might end in June 2022, or what's the landscape there?
So in terms of, I didn't quite catch who asked the question, but it doesn't matter. So in terms of FIAL's in terms of what's the future for FIAL and the growth centres, I think the Minister Porter has been very clear to say that the growth centres have to look for sustainable operating models, and I do believe that one of the growth centres, Cyber, has already transitioned to a sustainable model, and they've partnered with an organisation. So all the growth centres have to look for a different platform for operating beyond June 2022. That's the first thing I'll say. But in terms of, I listen to what the government says, but I suppose it's about delivering value and impact. So we've had 4 cliffs in terms of funding over the last period of 8 years. And what we've always focused on is delivering value. And through that process, through delivering value, we've actually been continuing. So so the answer to the question is there is a future, irrespective of whether FIAL as an organisation continues or not. In terms of our legacy programs and what we have delivered will continue in one shape or form, and details around that will emerge in the coming months.
Thank you, Mirjana. It's always a moving cycle, and yes, I agree with you. It's the delivery that matters. I have another question from Wallace Cowling, or more of a comment, that the third largest crop and crop protein source in Australia is canola. Mm-hmm. It was missing from your table.
I can't remember. It might be a definitional thing.
Okay.
Because it's United Nations definition, so it's not.
All right, no worries. Yeah, and we know that now omega-3 canola is also going to be there. So yeah, value adding there. Professor Wong from UQ says, nice presentation, Mirjana, and we all agree. He would like some comment on seafood proteins in Australia. Where do you see the future of seafood proteins or production in Australia?
Well, I think it's a bit of a balanced approach. It'll be through aquaculture. So that's in terms of how do we become sustainable. We've been also, one of the 19 opportunities is sustainable fisheries. And what we have done is there is a roadmap. So I do encourage you, one thing I forgot to mention is each of the 19 roadmaps, each of the 19 opportunities has a roadmap that explains what needs to be done to realise that value. And so I do encourage you. So I think it'll be a combination. It won't be one or the other. It'll be a combination. And I think there has to be a holistic approach in consideration of sustainability and the impact to the environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mirjana, and we might come back to you at the end of the second speaker as well, if there are more questions for you as well at the open Q&A. So thank you once again, and we'll move on now to our next distinguished speaker for this talk. And I feel very privileged to now introduce John Harvey. John is the Managing Director of AgriFutures Australia. And he's a change maker for transforming existing industries, as well as he's also looking at new high value industries. And prior to his appointment as the Managing Director for AgriFutures, he has been at various positions in GRDC, or the Grain Research Development Councils, as well as Managing Director there as well. He has been involved with Pulse Breeding Australia, Barley Breeding Australia, National Soybean Breeding Program, and has, just as I mentioned about Mirjana, has been involved with CRCs as well. I've been engaging with John actually, and have really enriched my knowledge on some of the emerging industries here in Australia, which we really need to look at when we think of the word AgriFutures. So thanks, John, for giving us this opportunity to hear from you, and over to you.
Thanks, Nina, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me a couple of seconds and I'll get that working. And hopefully now you can see my my screen. Just by way of introduction, and thank you for the introduction, Nina. AgriFutures Australia is one of 15 research development corporations. All of the research development corporations are a partnership between the federal government and farmers, levy payers. Typically, levy payers pay a levy, and that's matched dollar for dollar by the federal government. To spend on research and development is around about $850 million per year. In terms of AgriFutures, we have 13 industries that we do research and development for. Industries like the chicken meat, rice, honeybees, ginger, and I won't go through the whole list, 13 industries. And that's very similar to how all of the RDCs operate. However, in addition to that, we have two mandates which are fully by the federal government. We've got a mandate for investing in new and emerging industries, and we're currently investing in 40 different industries like truffles, seaweed, hemp seed, coffee, chocolate, and I won't go through the list of 40 either. And finally, our last mandate is to invest in industries that go right across the whole of agriculture. Now, I'm just going to move through my slides, so bear with me. What I want to do is talk about the future forces on agriculture. And this is an old slide. This is a slide from 2014, some work that Deloitte did, and they looked at the prospectivity of industries in Australia. And you can see there on the bottom graph, you can see where's Australia got a strong advantage. So as you go to the right, we get stronger. And you can see on the vertical axis there, what's the global opportunity. And I put this slide up because you can see there, in terms of prospectivity, agribusiness is right up there with very high prospectivity, higher prospectivity back then, higher than mining, higher than virtually any other sector in Australia. And talking about future forces, I thought, what were we saying, 5 years ago about the future of agriculture? And you can see there, it was seen as bright. And I believe that over the last 5 years, overall, that's been pretty right. When you think about the growth that we've seen in agriculture, the growth in value, the growth in exports, particularly over the last 12 months where we've had some decent seasons, we have seen an expand. We've seen some good prices and we've seen some good production. In 2015, we did some work looking at what are the megatrends, and this was done in partnership with CSIRO. And these were the 5 areas that were identified as megatrends back then: hungrier world, bumpier ride, choosier customers, a wealthier world, and transformational technologies. And again, when you look at each of those trends, you'd have to say the population in the world has continued to grow. We've certainly had a bumpier ride when you think about bushfires, climate change, droughts, cyclonic episodes in other parts of the world, and then more recently with things like COVID-19. But we've also had a bumpier ride in terms of markets and prices. They have really jumped around and fluctuated. In terms of wealthier world, you can see particularly the burgeoning middle class in China has had a huge impact on Australia up until now. And choosier customers, the customers wanting to know much more about their product, and that's certainly starting to come true. And lastly, in the middle there, we've got our transformational technologies, and that has also come through with 3D printing, artificial intelligence, gene editing, Internet of Things, sensors, whatever. There's a whole range of technologies that we're now seeing transforming food and agriculture right across the whole world, and also here in Australia, very importantly. So recently, we're repeating this work, basically, looking forward and saying, well, what are the forces for change that are likely to impact on us over the next 10 years? This is a report which you can download and have a look at from our website at agrifutures.com.au. And this particular report has been put together in partnership with Authentic Advisory, which is an Australian-based agri-food tech advisory company led by Sarah Nollett, which a number of you probably would know Sarah, and also in partnership with the Institute for the Future, which is an institution based in Palo Alto in California. And I just want to run you through some of the drivers that came out of this study. I think they're really quite interesting, and what is fascinating is they're really quite different to the ones that came out of the report we did with CSIRO 4 or 5 years ago. So that, if you look at that slide, I'm just run through quickly. The first one there is in red, viral disinformation in the food system. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've heard a lot about fake news, and we're seeing the impact that it has on people's perception. And this driver for change is one which has really come out of the fake news experience, but the driver is that there's no reason to suspect that it won't also impact on the value chain, food value chain. And just to give you a bit of a flavour of this, and if you're interested, you can go and have a look at the full report, but a research published on GM crops and food is saying, this was done in 2019, has found a distinct pattern in Russian news providing evidence of coordinated information campaigns that could turn public opinion against GM engineering. So 57% of the material in social media was sourced back to being of Russian sources, and 47 from the US. Another example is the Oxford Internet Institute found that organised social media manipulation has more than doubled between 2017 and 2019, with 70 countries using computational propaganda to manipulate public opinion. So that's So I guess the issue here is, what's that mean for agriculture and what's that mean for the food system? And if you can play that out, what if somebody for competitive reasons or simply out of malice was to start a campaign against your company and to put out information about maybe you've got a food safety issue, and it may be completely false, but with social media campaigns, with blogging, whether it's true or it's not true, you'll have to have put in place a strategy to counter it. So that's one of the drivers. And again, if you want to find out information about that, by all means, have a look at the website. The second one is the interconnected digital infrastructure or Internet of Things. And Mirjana touched on this, but we are getting much more connected value chains in the food and agriculture industry. To give you an example, if you look at the growth of Internet of Things connections worldwide in 2015, we had 3.8 billion connections worldwide. By this current year, we've got 11.6 billion connections, and it's predicted that by 2025 we'll have 21.5 billion connections. And this automated collection of data about various components of the value chain is clearly changing customer expectations, customer experience, the production experience, and what, in the case of farmers, what farmers are actually expected to do and provide when they produce food. If you look at the growth in the market for AI, artificial intelligence in agriculture, in 2020, it was $1.1 billion. By 2030, we're looking at it being worth about $10.8 billion. That's a cumulative growth rate of about 25% per annum. And then the other player here is Moore's Law. And when you look at how that translates, back in 1971, we had 2,300 transistors per chip. We've currently got something like 19 billion transistors per chip. When you start looking at things like 3D computing, DNA computing, and quantum mechanics, you really can see only really see the power of computing increasing dramatically over the next 10 years. The third one is rewiring the grid. In Australia here, we've very much been based on a centralised production of electricity and then a distribution network. There's every chance that over the next 10 or 15 years, we'll see that potentially even get to the point where it reverses, where we're actually generating and producing energy from a distributed network and potentially conveying it to a central point where we might use it for things like steel smelting and aluminium smelting and other uses. But again, prediction of the Energy Networks Australia is that by 2050, 45% of electricity will be generated from a distributed energy production system, and only 55% will be produced centrally. There are other organisations like the Australian Energy Market Operator who are predicting, on a conservative scenario, that we will be producing 27 gigabytes just from these new technologies, renewable technologies by 2025, and that up to 75% of the energy generated in Australia could be coming from renewables under a slightly more aggressive strategy. And then into the spectrum, you throw hydrogen, and even just over the next 5 years, the expectation is that the increase in storage in the storage market for hydrogen is likely to increase at greater than 5% per annum. So big changes in how energy is produced, distributed and used right across the whole of society, but very specifically in culture. In terms of domesticating the cell, the pink, the green that we have there, what we've seen, of course, is a massive exponential drop in the price of gene sequencing. If you remember back in 2001 when we did the first human genome, it cost something like $100 million. Today we can sequence a human genome for under $1,000. A really interesting little fact here is there's a group over in an international genetics engineering group who encourage students to build a novel living system. They started in 2004, and it's now grown from 5 teams to 300 teams and 40,000 students involved in building novel living systems using synthetic biology. And from that, a whole range of synthetic biology companies have emerged. And we've all heard what's going on with synthetic meat and other synthetic products. And then just finally, looking at the investment in synthetic biology and companies, 2017, we had 245 companies worldwide with an investment of about $3.4 billion. And 2 years later, 2019, that's risen to 6.9 billion and 385 companies. So massive growth in companies investing in synthetic biology around the world. And then finally, in the green, new geographies of climate change. The SIGIR system, the international centres, their prediction is that 9 out of 10 crops their growth rates will decrease as a consequence of climate change. You can certainly, the predictions are to see the valuable agricultural crops moving both further north in the northern hemisphere and further south in the southern hemisphere. And also there's predictions, of course, about desertification in certain areas which are highly productive at the moment. So there are some of the key drivers that have been identified, and really just there as thought provokers. We can't predict the future, no one can. And the design, this project is designed to do is just to get people thinking about what could possibly be, what could happen, what scenarios might exist. It's a dangerous game to then think you can predict the future, but at least if you've thought about what could and what couldn't happen, that helps you to do your strategic planning. So I do trust that that's been useful to you. But I do want to leave you with one more. This report we did it was published about 6 months ago. And since then, of course, we've had COVID and we're coming to terms with COVID. And if I was able to, I would add one more box onto that diagram, and that would be nationalisation. So over the last 6 months with COVID, no travel, I think what we're seeing really strongly emerge is a much stronger sense of nationalisation around the world, a higher demand for countries to be self-sufficient and concerned about their value chains and where they're going to get resources from. And we can see that playing out in the geopolitics of the world right at the moment. And now, so what's AgriFutures doing about it? What's our take home? One of the things we try to do in AgriFutures is look very much about what is ahead, but also what can we do about it right now? One of the things that we've done over the last few years is run an event called Evoke Ag. Hopefully some of you would have been there and seen it. A large international event, about 1,500 people in Melbourne, really looking at the future of food, shining a spotlight on the fantastic innovation that's occurring here in Australia, and also showing the world that we were a great partner to do business with. We partnered with Austrade. We had 9 trade missions, and we had investment capital from around the world come to Melbourne twice. And I estimate that it's probably had something like $4 billion worth of managed capital in the room. So whilst we're looking at the future, we're also looking at what can we do about it. And I think with a lot of the new technologies, the digital technologies, it is a global market. It's important that we see ourselves as part of that global ecosystem, interacting with it, getting ideas from it, but also supporting it and delivering to it as well. And then, and so you can see we've very much broadly targeted VocAg at a range of different players, not just one particular sector. Important to get everybody in the conversation. That's the countries where we had people visiting Australia to participating in GrowAg. In terms of going forward, we are planning on running a VocAg again. We'll be running it in West Australia in February next year. And that is the location, that is the actual location where we'll be holding a VocAg next year in Perth. And we're also looking at running one in Sydney. So one in Perth, one in Sydney, one-day events, again, trying to connect the various players in the ecosystem. Since with COVID and the need to pivot from doing physical events, we have established a new platform, an online platform called growag.com. Again, I'd encourage you to go in there. If you go into GrowAg, you'll see we have listed there all of the research projects that are carried out by all of the RDCs, all 15 RDCs. You can search by topic, you can search by your interest area. And we also are listing on there all the commercial opportunities that are coming out of the RDC. So if you're a startup, or if you're an SME, or if you are a corporate from Australia or overseas, whatever, if you want to do business, come and have a look at the commercial opportunities. And finally, we've got organisations that are in the Australian ecosystem. Again, one of the feedback we had from people that came out to a VocAg is, so who's who in the zoo? If we wanted to investigate more around, say, robotics and horticulture, who would we talk to? So we've put a map there. It is actually in map view, so you can look at a map of Australia and plan out your trip and who you need to visit. So I might leave it there if that's all right. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, John. Thanks a lot. Lot of, once again, thoughts for the future, how we deal with things. So yeah, a couple of questions for you, John. One was when I looked at that picture of mega trends, and I always sort of, start thinking on one end is a hungrier world and on the other end is a wealthier world. And that paradox always exists, and I've seen it happening. Where do you see Australia sits there for Australia and for the globe?
Well, so in some ways, this carries on very nicely from what Mirjana said, and that is, we've typically exported low-value products. So I often think of your country, India, and the fact that we send very cheap chickpeas to India, and there's so many different ways that we could value add before it left Australia. And I do think there is huge prospectivity in the immediate post-farm gate part of the business to do more and create higher value products. Again, Mirjana's slide of when you look at the volume of protein and the value of protein, there's an obvious question there is, well, how can we some of our lower value plant-based proteins into higher value markets? And of course, that's where a lot of the V2 and other activities are going. And I think they've got great opportunities being so close to China, so close to Southeast Asia and China, to be able to create more value out of the same materials.
Thanks, John. Yeah, some more to think about on that space. Just a couple of more questions for you, and then I'll come back to Mirjana as well. There are more questions that I would love to ask to both of you. So this question is from Paul Wood, John, and maybe both of you can address that. In the Deloitte map, when it was done in 2004, manufacturing was on the far left corner. Yet the government now has a major funding strategy in this space. So the question Paul is asking is, what does this say about these types of future prediction models? So John, maybe you first.
Look, as I said before, you really can't predict the future, and you're always going to be wrong. But what I do think is happening and changing is that with smart manufacturing, maybe Australia is going to become more competitive in that space. We've got educated population. We're good at innovation. We've got the raw commodity on our doorstep. We produce it. I really do believe that developing an advanced manufacturing sector would be fabulous to actually complement our skill and our ability and our to produce the raw product. So it is a beautiful fit, and I do think I'm really very supportive of the concept of putting more into it and getting more of it up and running in Australia. And it goes back to that value adding component.
Thank you. So Mirjana, your take on how reliable are the future prediction models, and what about the Modern Manufacturing Initiative?
I concur with what John's saying. I think we should be using these reports and all the modelling as an indicator of space that we should be moving towards. But I don't think it's like when you start a business, you have an idea of what your business opportunity is. As you start working on your business, a lot of things go out and you have to moderate and have to adapt. So I think it's not about the preciseness of it. I think it's about identifying where there is opportunities and then being adaptable and agile in your response. So I think, what we're going to see, the rate of change, the unpredictability of the future, forces coming in, the last 2 years, the way the food and agribusiness sectors has had to adapt and be agile. We had floods, we had fires, we've had, African swine fever. We've had all these conditions, and then we had the pandemic. And so it's imposed, there's a new sense of constant change. And so therefore the businesses that survive going into the future are the ones that can adapt. So it's about being adaptable and open and changing and not being fixated. So having your direction, but then being able to move around quickly as information comes to hand, I think is going to be the key.
Thank you.
And I think that's where the design-led approach, and that's one of the things that the Modern Manufacturing Initiative talks about, is how do you embed design? And what that effectively does is saying the more connected you are to your end customer and your markets and your environment, the more you'll be able to respond and iterate how you respond, because they're the businesses that are going to survive and actually be able to adapt to the change.
Thank you. Thanks, Mirjana. A question for you, John, once again from Paul Wood. Where do you see the AIA initiative fitting into the local system?
Right, thanks. And thanks for the question, Paul. So AIA is Agricultural Innovation Australia, and it's a company limited by guarantee, and the members are all 15 research and development corporations. And so a number of people, Paul, and you're not the first one to ask this, are saying, well, how does AIA fit in relation to AgriFutures and our mandate in the space of cross-sectoral? And my answer to that is, well, it's a very large space. There's enough room for both of us. That's not a problem. So in general terms, AIA has been set up to very much deal with a small number of large transformational projects. It's been set up in a structure which is agile, outside of government. And so it is a great vehicle for brokering private capital and private investment as well. So I think large transformational projects and in partnership between the RDCs and private sector capital is where I think AA has a great and important role to play. We'll continue to run our Emerging National Rural Issues Forum. We've got it actually happening tomorrow, where we get all the research and development corporations together and we identify where there's opportunities for collaboration. We've had over 140 ideas go through that process. and AIA will be participating in that process tomorrow. Where the big ones, I think you'll find the RDC saying, now that one's one where we'd be better off doing it through AIA, and it will move into AIA.
Thank you. Thank you. We are watching the AIA space closely in this space. So thanks. And question from Lindsay Falvey for both of you, both the speakers. Can each speak? First of all, she's saying very impressive presentation, so thank you. Can each speaker elaborate on the changes in the livestock industries? What's your take on the changes that are taking place in the livestock industries at the moment? If you could have a comment there, John.
So it's not, yeah, look, it's not a, I'll be really honest with you. My whole career has been in grain until I got to AgriFutures, and now it's broadened out a fair bit. But look, I think there's a whole lot of things happening in livestock. There's certainly for the first time some huge technologies, virtual fencing, tagging, and this connection to the consumer is going to be huge, I think, in the meat industry. I see a huge opportunity for meat to end up as a real premium product, and I certainly see the opportunity for it to play a complementary role with plant-based proteins as well, but at the much higher end. But that's really important, because it means you've got to actually provide the data and the information and the value add to the product to capture that value. So where was it grown? How was it grown? Was it grown sustainably? Is it carbon neutral? They are all bits of information which we've now got technology to be able to flow through to the customer. So I do think there's some big opportunities for the beef industry to capitalize on that. I've been around probably 25 years or probably longer, but I think at the moment, in terms of the cattle industry, I've never seen so many technologies that are applicable that could transform and create value that, as we're seeing just now.
No, thanks, John. And I am aware of the digital twins concept happening in the cattle industry as well, linking the genomic sequence information to predicting, the cattle health right on the farm. So yeah, those technology advancements are happening. Mirjana, what's your take? Plant-based proteins and the livestock industries.
I'm a bit like John. I focus at the other end of the value chain, but I think in terms of the livestock industry is actually a valuable raw material that goes into what we eat. So it's either as a product, as meat, or it goes into making a process like a casserole or whatever it may be. So I think in terms of, as my slides show, the livestock industry, I think, will always be important, but they're coming under increasing pressure in terms of the animal welfare, the social responsibility and of how we're looking after the animals, but also the environmental impact it has on carbon emissions, particularly in the dairy industry and the cattle industry. So I think, the demand for the industry is there, but I think they're going to be under increasing pressure, particularly as consumers are increasingly connected, as one of the key trends, we've all got up-to-date devices and we're connected to information, whether it's credible or not, it doesn't matter. The point is it's available and people are searching and they're making decisions, informed decisions about what they eat based on, how you are looking after that animal as well. So I think they're going to come under increasing pressure to conform. That's going to increase cost. And I think, John's touched on a lot of the technologies that's giving us that visibility, in terms of tracking the animals. I mean, the bigger cheese are looking at a whole circular economy and how they can trace the carbon, actually be carbon neutral in their valley, so in terms of a proposition to the consumer. So I think provenance, traceability, the environmental impact is going to be increasingly more important. So I think they're going to become more sophisticated because they have to be if they're going to play on the global marketplace.
Thank you. So maybe one more question from both of you, and then maybe we might wrap up for the evening. Choosy customer was the term used by John, and provenance came up, Mirjana, in your talk. Mm-hmm. What's your opinion as to how choosy customer and provenance are going to drive what will happen in the agri-food sector?
Do you want me to go first, John? Or
yeah, go for it.
Well, I think we're seeing that already playing out. you know, when COVID hit, the impact of COVID, customers are already choosy, and, you know, they're buying more local. And I think, you know, John touched on nationalisation. I think, you know, people are becoming increasingly buying local. They're becoming increasingly careful about where they buy, what they buy, where is it being. So I think it's actually been playing out in the last 18 months with the COVID pandemic. We're seeing it playing out. And I think as technologies and tools that are at our fingertips, are going to see more and more of that play out. So I think it's the choosier customer. And I think when I talked about that spectrum of wellness, you know, we have got so much information at our fingertips through social media, the internet, and we make informed decisions based on that. Whether it's credible or not, that's another matter, but we are making decisions about what we buy, what we put into our mouth. So I think it's being played out, and I think it's here to stay. We're going to see that confluence of information coming at us and processing more and more. And I think the real value is going to be into the future, credible sources of that information.
Thanks, Mirjana. John, any more words to add there?
Not maybe just a couple, but I think Mirjana's probably covered most of it. I think that last point's really important about, and I was trying to make that point about, you know, this virus information. So you might be having the best production system in the world, great provenance, and somebody can come in, they can use viral disinformation to completely discredit your product. And you've got to be ready as a producer or a small producer with lots of your value tied up, not just the product, but with the information that goes with the product. You've got to be ready to defend at short notice if that does happen. So I think there's some issues there, some challenges. So there are upsides, but there's going to be a few things we're going to have to put in place to capture that value. The second one is we run in partner with the other AESTs, we do a community survey. We survey 6,000 people around Australia every year about their attitude towards agriculture and trust in farmers. And what is interesting is that the thing that correlates most highly with trust is how well farmers look after the land and environmental outcomes. It's even higher than good value food and fibre is how well the land's looked after. So I think, you know, some of this provenance, some of this enthusiast customer is going to want information about how well the land is looked after by farmers. That'll be part of their choosiness.
Thank you. I mean, I really resonates, you know, that social licensing to operate, or the socialization of the idea, and provenance throughout the value chain is important. I have two more questions, so I think I'll go ahead and ask them because they're really good questions. One is from Beth Woods. So the question is, Australian products have been marketed on quality and integrity. How do you see us linking these systems with nutritional quality and health, which will surely remain significant priorities for the consumer? So how do we link the focus across the business, industry, or national levels? One of you maybe can take that.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Hello, Beth.
Shall I repeat? I'm happy to repeat the question.
Yeah.
So the question is about, you know, Australian brand, the trust in Australian food, about our quality and integrity. And these are important priorities for consumers. So the question is, how do we link the focus across the business, industry, or national levels? How do we link this focus, you know, this focus on integrity, on quality across business, industry, and national level sectors?
I think we already are. So that's why I suppose because we, you know, when we're selling our product overseas, we are known for, you know, premium. You know, we've got a good regulatory system. You know, our products are safe. No one in Australia ever picks up a piece of food and questions, is it safe to eat? So, and that's to some extent why people buy. I know you're shaking your head, Nina, but
yeah, no. It's a question of traceability. So that's what Beth has elaborated as well, that how do we get our traceability systems up to speed? It's about food traceability kind of question.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood the question. I think we already are starting to do that, particularly across different product types. So in the meat industry, I think there's good examples of traceability. In the vegetable industry, strawberries, there are tools out there through Excavox. So I think the challenge will be, because the food industry is so diverse, it's very hard in terms of how do you trace a raw material throughout the value chain. So I think we've got to first of all start with the specific, like subsectors such as meat, lamb, pork, individual industries, and then look at how we combine it in terms of tools. Now, I know the food waste people are actually looking at apps that they can actually trace, so you can actually see where your food's going and you can actually start to track it across the supply chain. But I think the food industry is quite complex, so you can't have one solution that cuts across because of just the depth and diversity that we have.
Thank you. Thank you. So one last question, and that question comes from Snow Barlow. How important do you think net carbon neutrality will be in the marketplace, both nationally and industry-wise?
So it will be very important, and it already is.
Yeah.
And you've just got to see what's happening in Europe and the idea of carbon taxes on imports from Australia. So it will be, I think that's, it's definitely happening and happening internationally. So I think you will only see that area. I mean, we'll only see the pressure for all industries to work towards carbon neutral increase over the next few years. And we're seeing it increase, significantly as we're starting to see temperatures rising a bit faster than what was expected under the trends. And when we're seeing our markets, some of our key partners and marketers and strategic alliances requiring some accountability around that, and where they've implemented domestic policies, they're not going to give imports a free ride. So I think some of that's going to drive it. Snow.
Thank you. Mirjana, anything to add there?
No, I think we're already seeing, and that's about the social license to operate. I think, the corporate responsibility, all firms, the triple bottom line, I think that's increasingly under pressure. And I think if you look at all the large players, particularly in the food sector, if you don't have the triple bottom line in focus, you actually won't be playing. And I think it's going to become, even more so as we go into the future, particularly as we've seen all the extreme weather conditions across the world. We've got fires in the US, we've had fires here, you've got cyclones, all the weather patterns have been disrupted. So I think as that becomes more and more to the forefront of people's mind, that pressure is going to go down to the businesses, and particularly the bigger businesses, because they're in the spotlight a lot more. But I suppose what it does provide is an opportunity for Australia's smaller businesses, because they're agile and smaller, and they're more nimble in terms of their ability to implement technologies and solutions to allow them to meet those requirements.
No, thanks. And Snow, as we've been talking about in this Ag Forum webinar series, agriculture does play a big role in emissions. We forget about that. We start talking of methane and other emissions, but agriculture does play a role. And if we leave it as business as usual, we won't be able to meet those targets of carbon neutrality or zero emissions. And that can come from various factors, like by increasing the yield, by reducing the food waste, which, like Mirjana, you mentioned about that carbon footprint. By just reducing the food waste can make a difference. Growing crops under controlled environments can make a difference. Less land, more produce can make a difference. So yeah, there's absolutely key things. Would like to wrap up here, call it a close. Thank you to our distinguished speakers on behalf of the Academy for very insightful and informative talks and very stimulating discussion. And my thanks also to the Ag Forum group of ATSI and the ATSI team, and Professor Wong, who is my fellow ATSI colleague at the UQ, who helped me put this webinar together. But really special thanks to the two speakers, and thanks to the audience, and thank you, and stay tuned for the next webinar in this series. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Nina.